The idea behind this video is to make things simple, because essentially hard work and consistency is the underlying message. Repeated dynamic contractions over time can create muscle hypertrophy. And at a time where many people are having to train at home, the idea of progressive overload methods perhaps becomes even more poignant. But this video is a two-way street. So as well as me communicating information, I would like your ideas also to add value to the video. And when we think about training at home, for example, you may have a limited amount of tools to work with. And that's where an understanding of progressive overload may help you to further challenge your muscle. And so as with all exercise science videos on this channel, I'm not telling you what you must do. I'm presenting ideas for you to think about, for you to analyze, and for you to adapt to your own needs and characteristics. And so progressive overload, very simply, is challenging your muscle over time and then increasing that challenge when, for example, your body adapts to a certain amount of weight on the bar. And so you can think of it as continually creating a stimulus for muscle growth. And the building of muscle is, of course, an anabolic process, and it does require the right environment, for example, protein intake and calorie intake. And so before we get into it, I want to start by recommending the paper Mechanisms of Hypertrophy by Dr. Schonfeld, as it's a good read about the basic principles of muscle growth, metabolic stress, mechanical tension, muscle damage. And remember, with any academic research, of course, there is nuance to it. Academic research is a contribution to a knowledge base. It does not give you set in stone principles that you must follow or else. But I do want to very quickly read the practical application at the end of the paper. Current research suggests that maximum gains in muscle hypertrophy are achieved by training regimens that produce significant metabolic stress while maintaining a moderate degree of muscle tension. A hypertrophy-oriented program should employ a repetition range of 6 to 12 reps per set, with rest intervals of 60 to 90 seconds between sets. Exercises should be varied in multiplanar, multi-angled fashion to ensure maximal stimulation of all muscle fibers. Multiple sets should be employed in the context of a split training routine to heighten the anabolic milieu. At least some of the sets should be carried out to the point of concentric muscular failure, perhaps alternating microcycles of sets to failure with those not performed to failure to minimize the potential for overtraining. Concentric repetitions should be performed at a fast to moderate speed, 1 to 3 seconds, while eccentric repetitions should be performed at a slightly slower speed, 2 to 4 seconds. Training should be periodized so that the hypertrophy phase culminates in a brief period of higher volume overreaching followed by a taper to allow for optimal supercompensation of muscle tissue. And so that's his summary of the ideas presented in the paper. Of course, you may discuss and debate those, but I just want to add the idea that muscle growth is not a linear process, and we know that beginners can increase their rate of muscle growth quicker than, for example, intermediate and advanced lifters who are closer to their genetic potential. And as you become more experienced in the gym, it's harder to eke out those extra muscle gains. No gains from weight training, be it mobility, hypertrophy, strength, power, endurance, or fat loss, will ever occur in a linear nature. The body doesn't work that way. Adaptations occur in waves. Sometimes you'll make big jumps in a single week in a particular quality, while other times you'll stall for 3 months in another quality. Over the long haul, everything goes up, but it's a windy road. And so I think that's really important. It's not linear. At times, you're going to hit plateaus. You're going to feel frustrated. And that's one scenario, for example, where thinking about different progressive overload methods may be useful for you. So now, with all these methods that I'll talk about, you can use multiple overload methods at the same time. You can incorporate them. You can mix and match. There are so many possibilities. Method 1, increase the weight. Increasing the weight for an exercise will increase the stress on the muscle. I think that's very commonly known. It's perhaps the most simple way of overloading your body, but also highly effective. And increasing the weight can create a greater force requirement, which can stimulate more motor units which contain muscle fibers. And I have detailed videos on how muscles grow, where I discuss issues such as increasing sarcomeres in parallel, sliding filament theory, motor units, muscle fibers, all that good stuff. It's important with progressive overload and really all fitness concepts to put yourself on a spectrum, to identify your characteristics. Are you a beginner trainer, intermediate? Are you advanced? Are you natural? Are you enhanced? Do you have medical issues? How much time availability do you have each week to train? All these types of variables will affect your programming. And so an application of that is, for example, a beginner trainer will most commonly use increasing the weight as their go-to overload method. It's accessible, it's simple, and it's effective. But more advanced lifters, of course, they're going to increase the weight, but they're also going to have to be a bit more creative, if you like. dip into other overload methods to stimulate their muscle fibers as they become higher and closer to their genetic potential. And these methods could be, for example, drop sets or supersets. You have things such as occlusion training, which has an evidence base for muscle growth. You have other methods such as eccentric loading, whatever it may be, these more creative methods that people do not have to use, to be clear, but they are other tools in the basket that people may want to use depending on their circumstances. Method 2, increasing repetitions. Increasing your volume can be another tool. Or you may, for example, adjust the load and the repetition ranges for a certain exercise. For example, you might incorporate protocols such as pyramid training or reverse pyramid training. I have a video on that, The Rock's not in it. Of course, repetitions and sets are another tool that you can manipulate to add stress to the muscle. And so interestingly, in the appetizer of a paper I showed from Dr. Schonfeld, he does have a section where he discusses that a period of higher volume can be beneficial for muscle growth. However, in his other work, he does state that volume also has an upper ceiling, where if you go beyond a certain amount of volume, it is perhaps not effective. We can think of that as a point of diminishing returns. The exact amount's not exactly known, but that's where research is interesting. You have advantages, disadvantages, you have contradictions with concepts. And so those are interesting ideas that you may consider. Method 3, increase your training frequency. Again, I have a video on training frequency where I reference research articles. And so when you think about your frequency, of course, that's a massive area to discuss on its own. But very briefly, variables such as your training split will affect your frequency, your time availability, the amount of times you train per week. If you increase that, of course, that would increase the workload and the stress on the muscle. Method 4, change the exercise for that muscle group or movement. And of course, you can hit muscles from multiple angles. You can use many tools of training. There are many different exercises for certain movements. There are many different tools you can use. You have free weights, you have machines, you have kettlebells, calisthenics. There's so much that you can do to try and change that stress on the muscle. Method 5 and 6, reduce your rest times between your sets. This idea very simply broken down. If your rest time decreases, you are more fatigued when you go to start that next set. Therefore, it's going to be a bit harder on the muscle. And at this point, I just want to reiterate, when I'm giving these explanations in this video, my intention, by intent, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. I do have more in-depth videos where I go deeper into the science all over this channel. And then method 6, we can think about tempo of lifting. Now, for example, some people will increase their time under tension on the eccentric contraction. Now, time under tension, just meaning that you're going to use a slower repetition for that negative, which would be more duration, more time, which can increase the stress. Now, importantly, with time under tension, it is not a magic tool for muscle growth. It is not a magic hack that you must use for muscle growth. It is just another tool that you may use to stress the muscle, but don't be confused with time under tension as being something that you absolutely have to use and it's absolutely magic. That's how it can be commonly presented in the fitness industry. It's just not quite accurate. Again, I have a science-based video where I reference the research on speed science, the tempo of lifting. Please go and watch that if you're interested in that.
This was not an exhaustive list. There are other methods of overload in addition to the selections in this video.
And so the takeaway with progressive overload, and really one of the main messages in this video, is it is not just about increasing your weight. There are many, many ways that you can further challenge your muscle. But the idea of using multiple different progressive overload methods over a few months, over a year, over a few years, over your active training time is interesting for many reasons. It may be exciting for you to use different protocols. This may help with your adherence to training, your consistency to training. You may use all of these methods. You may not use all of these methods. You may just use a few methods, but hammer consistently at that over time. And that's very good also. The idea is that training is variable. It depends on us. There is a huge element of personal preference, and there's not a one-size-fits-all, this is right, this is wrong, that I see so commonly communicated in YouTube, for example. And so my question to you is, right now in your training cycle, what overload methods are you using and what exercises for? And I'm imagining that down below, I'm going to see many, many different forms of protocols and overload methods, and that should instantly be a sign of just how creative people can be. Not standing on both balls squatting creative, just creative with different protocols. And so just to end, when it comes to perhaps more advanced methods of overload, there's also an idea of eccentric loading, and I think I'm going to make an individual video on that because there's a lot to talk about with that, but there's a real common misconception with that. And so those perhaps more advanced niche overload methods are interesting, but there's certainly a lot to think about with them. And so I'm James Linker. I hope this video was useful. It was simple. You can take it away today. I'll see you soon.